War. The Civil War doesn't technically start until 1861, but there are decades of movements and developments and things happening that eventually make the Civil War in 1861 a reality. And one of the interesting things that not many people know about the Civil War is what almost became the 13th Amendment. The famous 13th Amendment in the US Constitution, toward the end of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment officially, legally ends slavery in the United States. Now, it took some time for the reality of that to catch up in terms of states rejoining the Union, all kinds of complicated things with that. But the 13th Amendment states that no one can be held as a slave or under involuntary servitude, meaning being forced to work, except for the punishment of a crime. So there was still allowable slavery, and there is today, for punishment of a crime. That being said, the 13th Amendment in the United States toward the ending of the Civil War is the amendment that legally brings slavery to an end in the United States. It's a famous moment. It also comes along with the 14th and the 15th Amendment. Now, before the Civil War, there was an amendment that almost became the 13th Amendment. And that amendment is known as the Corwin Amendment. And it had the approval, at least in theory, of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln even alludes to, he doesn't mention the name of this amendment outright in his first inaugural address, his first speech as president. And by the way, an amendment, remember, is a change, an edit of the Constitution. There's a certain process for doing that in the Article 5 of the Constitution that explains how that is supposed to take place. And so there was this amendment put forward by this representative whose last name was Corwin that would have become the 13th Amendment if it had passed and become a reality, which it almost did. So I call this the almost 13th Amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment that we know today, the actual 13th Amendment, legally ends slavery. But this almost 13th Amendment, listen to what it says. Here's the text. It says, "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions," which would have included slavery, "thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by laws of said state." Now, that may sound a little bit complicated and not clear exactly what it means, but what this amendment is basically saying is that it is an amendment that would forever prevent Congress, the US government that makes the laws, from ever interfering with the domestic institutions of any state. In other words, this is an amendment which would have stopped the US government forever from ever interfering with slavery. In other words, it would have made it illegal for the US government to try to get rid of slavery or tamper with slavery. Now, this is an area of disagreement between the sections of the Union. And the fear in the slave states is that the free states and the US government will use the power of the US government to interfere with slavery. So this amendment was offered as a promise that it would make it illegal for the US government to try to end slavery in any state. The goal of this amendment was to attempt to keep the Union together, to promise if slavery was the cause of the Civil War, which it was, and the slave states were concerned that the US government would attempt to end slavery. This amendment was put out to say the US government will make it illegal to do that. Now, the states themselves could choose to end slavery, theoretically, but this amendment would have disallowed that from ever happening. So here's the historical irony, is that the 13th Amendment, the actual 13th Amendment that we know today, legally brought slavery to an end in the United States. But the almost 13th Amendment would have made it illegal for the United States government to try to end slavery. Further, it's also interesting that the US government, in large measure, was a great enforcer of slavery because in the Constitution, it required slaves who escaped from slave states into free states to be legally returned. And that's going to become an issue in a famous court case that comes before the Supreme Court. How can someone who is in a state where slavery is illegal be sent back to a state where slavery is legal? That requires the free states to enforce slavery on behalf of the slave states. Now, this amendment had quite a bit of approval. Lincoln mentioned it in his first inaugural address. It says here in this constitutional amendment area that we're talking about reporting on this. It says Mr. Lincoln had advised the Republicans. Lincoln is the first Republican president of that new political party. Mr. Lincoln has advised that the Republicans of his state should support Mr. Corwin's constitutional amendment, which passed the House, prohibiting Congress from interfering with the domestic institutions of the South. So Lincoln was in support of this amendment. Lincoln says himself directly in the first inaugural address, his first official speech as president, that he has no plans to attack or try to bring slavery to an end. However, he does threaten the use of force for the collection of taxes from the southern states. So the issue of slavery involved in the Civil War becomes a little bit more complex than most people first realize. In addition, see how close this amendment actually came to being passed. The Corwin Amendment sought to protect slavery forever by a constitutional amendment. The House approved the amendment by 133 to 65 votes. So most people voted for it. February 28th, 1861. The Civil War officially starts in April of 1861. The Senate, so remember that there has to be this approval of a bill that becomes a law, and especially in Article 5 of the Constitution, of an amendment that would change the Constitution. It has to be approved by a certain amount in the House and in the Senate, and then by the 3/4 of the states. So the House approved. The Senate also approved it by 24 to 12. And then before Lincoln, there's a president named President Buchanan. Even though this is not part of the constitutional process to make an amendment, Buchanan was trying to avoid the southern states leaving the Union. So he tried to show his approval of this amendment, saying, hey, we're not going to touch slavery. The US government won't interfere with slavery. President Buchanan signed this amendment before leaving office. Now, that doesn't mean anything. It just was symbolic that the president approved this. And then Lincoln also mentions his approval of this, even though it had not been approved or ratified yet by the states. And so this is an important aspect of leading to the Civil War, because it demonstrates the complicated nature of how slavery played into the Civil War, because there was a good amount of the people in the US federal government who were promising to create an amendment that would have made it impossible for them to end slavery, at least at the federal government level. And so you see during this time, these great protections for slavery are being offered. And by the word great, I just mean that they are big and powerful, potentially, protections of slavery are being offered. On the other hand, there are different things going on in each of the individual states and in the regions and down to individual people, because individuals in free states are very upset by this type of thing as well, because this means that they will have to continue to subsidize the slave states by action of the federal government. And so this is part of what begins to lead to the Civil War that will take place very shortly after this amendment.